Before I carry on with this video, I gotta check something real quick. Excuse me.
And stay down there, you prick!
You don't need me to tell you that 2020 was a bad year for a lot of reasons, but hey, not all bad news. Nostalgia came back in a big way, yeah. In the last 12 months, we've seen a revival of the Spanish flu of 1918, the civil rights protests of the 1960s, and we could be witnessing a return of the Great Depression. History buffs, 2020 was your year. Somehow through all this, wrestling has still been chugging along, and in spite of everything happening in the outside world, there's been a lot of cool things happening in our world. So much so, in fact, I couldn't possibly narrow it down to a top 8. So this week, I'm going to give you my picks for the top 16 best things about wrestling in 2020. Just getting it out of the way now, the Brody Lee tribute show is obviously the best thing we saw in 2020. A beautiful send-off to a beautiful human being that made me cry so much my head hurt. Nothing can touch that. So with that, here's everything else. Number 16, Orange Cassidy. In the year plus they've been in business, AEW's hired a lot of guys and gals who have polarized the fan base, but perhaps none so as much as freshly squeezed Orange Cassidy. Orange's character is kind of an anomaly in wrestling. At a time when everybody wants to be super serious and gritty and lay their attacks in snug, Cassidy is the complete antithesis of that. Often sloth-like and lackadaisical in his mannerisms, with his hands almost always in his pockets, and you wouldn't believe how mad that makes some people. If you saw him before he got signed, you knew what Orange was able to do, but most fans didn't really know until he took on Pac at the Revolution pay-per-view back in February, when he blew the live crowd away with his sudden quickness and athleticism. Though he lost that match, he made a believer out of a lot of folks that night. And the year only got better for him as well, as he became the only person to beat Chris Jericho more than once all year, wrestled some great matches with Cody Rhodes over the TNT title, moved a ton of merch, and inspired a whole lot of cosplayers. He was unconventional, but he was a contender. Orange Cassidy is an acquired taste, to be sure, one that some may never acquire, but for all he was able to accomplish this year, becoming one of the most popular stars in AEW without having to kill himself in the ring, that makes him one of the smartest guys in the business. Oh, and speaking of business, number 15, The Hurt Business. Throughout WWE's pandemic era, there's been a select group of men and women who have stepped up as the company's workhorses. Zelina Vega and her crew, Asuka, AJ Styles, the Street Profits, Randy Orton, Kevin Owens, to name a few. But few mainstays have been as consistently impressive as the Hurt Business. When MVP first came back to the company at the Royal Rumble, few fans probably thought much of it. But over time, he's become an incredibly valuable member of the show as both a wrestler and a manager. After a fleeting mentorship with the mighty Don't Kneel, MVP hooked up with Bobby Lashley, and as the year went on, they added Shelton Benjamin and Cedric Alexander. Not only did those four benefit from joining forces, the wrestlers they feuded with also received a boost, guys like Apollo Crews and Ricochet. These guys have all been working hard, but as the nucleus of the Hurt Business, MVP deserves a ton of credit for helping raise these guys up. He's a phenomenal talker and has built everyone up involved, raising everyone's stock. Lashley was floundering with the storyline with Lana and Rusev before MVP came along, and now most people have forgotten about it. Guys like Shelton and Cedric were not doing anything of note until they joined the Hurt Business, and now they're all champions. Needless to say, business has been good. Number 14, The Rise of Otis. In a year where there's not been a whole lot of feel-good moments to go around, at least one guy can say he had a great year when everyone least expected it. Otis began 2020 as the comical half of Heavy Machinery, pining for Mandy Rose. In one of the better developed storylines of the year, that angle soon blossomed into a love triangle involving Dolph Ziggler, who was scheming with Sonya Deville to tank the relationship between Otis and Mandy. One thing led to another, and soon Otis found himself in a singles match with Ziggler at WrestleMania. Not only did he win that match, he walked away with a girl, and you know what? It was one of the brighter points on a surprisingly strong Mania weekend. But if that wasn't enough for Otis, he ended up winning the Money in the Bank briefcase in that wild match at WWE headquarters in Stamford. And even though he ended up not cashing it in before losing it to The Miz, to go from being in one half of a middling tag team to winning a pay-per-view main event is an astounding turnaround in less than a year. Kudos to Otis. Number 13, Sting debuts in AEW. It's often been said, wrestling is all about making moments. WWE's lived by that philosophy for years, sometimes to the detriment of the rest of its product. But on one December episode of Dynamite, AEW fans got an epic moment of their own. As Team Taz was beating down Cody Rhodes and Darby Allin in the ring, the lights went out and snow began to fall in Florida. Suddenly, the icon Sting emerged in full makeup on TV for the first time in 5 years, looking stoic and intense as ever as he scared off the baddies and stared down the babyfaces. Since then, it's been announced that Sting has signed with AEW for many years. What he'll be doing at this point is unknown, and at 61 years of age, the idea of him wrestling scares more than a few fans. But with the amount of mystique and intrigue he had in that debut, he may never have to. His first AEW appearance was a big shock that got the wrestling world talking and was a great boon for the company. Now we'll have to see if it's worth the investment. Number 12. Pat McAfee can wrestle. Whenever a celebrity enters the wrestling world, there's a general sense of trepidation among wrestling fans. There are plenty of examples of outsiders being out of their element once they're in the wrestling ring, even if they have an athletic background. But after this year, it's safe to say that Pat McAfee is an exception to the rule. McAfee, a former All-Pro punter for the Indianapolis Colts and the head of his own media empire, began to work with WWE in an analyst role back in 2018. He began a slow-burning feud with Adam Cole back then, but it wasn't until this year where things really heated up. Pat wrestled only twice this past year, against Cole in a singles match at TakeOver 30 and at War Games opposite the Undisputed Era alongside Pete Dunne, Oney Lorcan, and Danny Burch. And in each of those matches, McAfee's performance was one of the highlights. Between his in-ring work and his snappy promos, Pat has fast become one of the best performers in the company this past year. I'll admit, when McAfee got into it with Cole this summer, I had some serious doubts as to where things would go. But after what he's accomplished this year, I'm looking forward to what he can do in 2021. Number 11. Kenny Omega. Since AEW began running shows, a lingering question has been, when will Kenny Omega finally live up to the hype that was built for him during his days in New Japan? And as 2020 came to a close, we may have seen a glimpse of what's to come. 1 month ago, Kenny finally fulfilled his destiny by beating Jon Moxley for the AEW title under controversial circumstances thanks to his good friend and Impact VP Don Callis, cementing his long-brewing heel turn of the process. Since then, Omega's not only appeared on Impact as the champion, but also performed at Triple Mania in Mexico to retain his AAA Mega Championship. Needless to say, Omega's been keeping himself busy since winning the title, exposing many AEW viewers to these other companies, which can only help everyone's business. And even if you don't include his title win in December, the rest of Omega's 2020 has been pretty solid in AEW. There was the Match of the Year candidate with the Young Bucks alongside Hangman Page in February, his involvement in the Stadium Stampede at Double or Nothing, and the great match he and Page had to determine a #1 contender. Had Omega won the title earlier in the year, I might have considered putting him a little higher on this list. But from what we've already seen him do in 2020, with the momentum he has now alongside Don Callis, there's no telling how high his ceiling can be as champion. Number 10. The ROH Pure Title Tournament. When the pandemic hit America, Ring of Honor was the first major promotion to shut down, just before their 18th anniversary weekend. Of all the shows that were canceled, one was meant to bring back the Pure Championship, which had been dormant in the company for 14 years. After several months off, ROH finally began taping again this August, where they went forward with their plans to revive the title, and in doing so, may have also revived lots of interest from previously disassociated fans. The company's on-air presentation has taken a much more sports-centric approach since their reboot, with a greater emphasis on that pure wrestling style. The title tournament featured great matches from guys like Dalton Castle, PJ Black, Tracy Williams, and more, but in the end it was Jonathan Gresham who went the distance and claimed the title for his own. The tournament was met with rave reviews, and Ring of Honor's approach was seen as a welcome change from what other companies were doing at the time. No frills, no outlandish gimmicks, just straight up wrestling, what the company was built on 18 years ago. That, combined with the company's rigorous COVID protocols at TV tapings, has built up a lot of goodwill for ROH as we go into the new year. Number 9. Jon Moxley, AEW Champion. I mentioned earlier how Kenny Omega's AEW title run has the potential to be great, but I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the awesome run that came before his. Jon Moxley started off the year hot, finally unseating Chris Jericho to become the second ever AEW World Champion at Revolution, and for nearly 10 months set a terrific standard for the championship and the AEW brand in general. Moxley wrestled everyone from veterans like Brian Cage and Lance Archer and Eddie Kingston to relative newcomers like Darby Allin and MJF. Whether they were straight up wrestling matches or hardcore brawls, Moxley delivered, elevating both himself and his opponents, and in doing so, the title as well. Guys like Chris Jericho, Omega, and Cody Rhodes all had good 2020s, but for my money, none were as strong as Jon Moxley as the conquering champion. After he left WWE in 2019, he had a lot of expectations to live up to, and it's safe to say this year he's exceeded most, if not all of them. Number 8. WrestleMania 36. In March of 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic reached a point in the U.S. that was no longer possible to ignore. One by one, every sports league and wrestling promotion stopped playing games and running shows because of the very real threat the virus possessed. For WWE and for the wrestling community at large, the timing couldn't have been worse, as WrestleMania 36 was fast approaching in the hotbed state of Florida. Long story short, every show and event that weekend got canceled except Mania somehow. Some planned matches were heavily altered or downright nixed. Instead of Raymond James Stadium in Tampa, the show moved to an empty performance center in Orlando, and the show is going to be stretched over 2 nights rather than just 1. Yeah, right off the bat, things felt kind of weird. But history often shows that when they're backed into a corner, WWE can find ways to knock it out of the damn park. And given the circumstances, I'd say they did just that. Fans at home witnessed some great in-ring performances, some with more shocking outcomes like in the WWE and Universal title matches, others in more drawn-out fights like between Kevin Owens and Seth Rollins or Charlotte Flair and Rhea Ripley. But perhaps more than those, Mania 36 will best be remembered for the Firefly Funhouse match with John Cena and Bray Wyatt and the Boneyard match with The Undertaker and AJ Styles. 2 high-concept pre-tape matches where the wrestling ring was either rarely used or non-existent, but captivating and entertaining all the same. And in the case of the Boneyard match, would end up being The Undertaker's final match. I mean, we'll see. WrestleMania weekend being blown to smithereens sucked for a variety of reasons, and I wouldn't have blamed the company if they decided to cancel their show like everyone else did. But WWE loves to push forward through things no matter what, and for one weekend they were able to defy expectations and put on a quality couple of shows, even if most of it took place in an empty building. Number 7. The Summer of Sasha and Bayley. Well, fans, we got it. We finally got the big blow-up between Sasha Banks and Bayley we've been clamoring for what feels like forever now. They finally did it. They finally pulled the trigger on it. Are you happy now? Huh? Are you happy? Because I am. Bayley was already having a great 2020 as the longest reigning SmackDown Women's Champion, but when she and her best friend Sasha started working together, things elevated even more. The partnership led to great success for the two of them as they dominated the women's division and even regained the women's tag titles, defending them on all 3 brands. And with Charlotte and Becky Lynch out of action for most of the year, these two became the standard bearers for female wrestlers in the company. Finally, in the fall, the two had their big implosion over the women's title and had a great blow-off at Hell in a Cell when Sasha claimed the blue and white belt for her own, and she's actually had a chance to run with it. These two have deserved to get their due for a long time now. With the spotlight on them so much and delivering great matches along the way, I think they finally got it. Number 6. The Return of Edge. In 2011, Edge was forced to walk away from wrestling after suffering a neck injury. It was a disappointing end to the career of a man who'd already accomplished so much yet arguably had a lot left to give. Fast forward to last year's Royal Rumble. In one of the most shocking moments all year, well, for those who don't read the rumor mill like myself, Edge made a surprise return of the Rumble match to one of the loudest ovations I've ever heard in wrestling and had a great performance in and of itself, leading to an emotionally charged feud with Randy Orton going into WrestleMania. If there was a silver lining to those awkward early pandemic era shows at the Performance Center, it was the great promos that Edge and Orton were cutting every week leading up to their big WrestleMania match. The last man standing match they had was kind of hard to get through, but their so-called greatest wrestling match ever at Backlash was far more entertaining, even if it may or may not have lived up that hype. Though Edge's comeback tour was derailed for the time being due to his triceps tear at Backlash, the fact that he's come back at all is a testament to Edge's mental and physical toughness. He's shown he still has gas left in the tank, so here's hoping we get to see more of what he can do in the coming year. Number 5. AEW and NXT rock. For the last year and change, AEW and NXT have been at odds nearly every Wednesday night, and in their first full year of competition, both companies pulled out all the stops to try and top one another. Both shows have consistently raised the stakes in an effort to draw eyeballs to the product. AEW debuted the TNT Championship and had some stellar debuts with guys like Brody Lee and Matt Hardy. NXT brought back old franchises like the Great American Bash and Halloween Havoc and treated them like takeovers. NXT elevated guys like Timothy Thatcher, Bronson Reed, and Leon Ruff. AEW did the same thing with guys like Will Hobbs, Ricky Starks, and Darby Allin. NXT's been killing it with their women's division lately, and AEW's... well, changing topics, how about all that wacky stuff with Chris Jericho? Dinner debonair, baby! The ratings may not always reflect the effort put forth, but both NXT and AEW deserve a lot of credit for what they did this past year. More so than Mondays or Fridays, Wednesdays have often been the most entertaining night of the week for a lot of fans. Number 4. The Cinematic Matches. When it comes to their product, Vince McMahon has famously said WWE makes movies. Then you'd see him drink bottled water really aggressively for no reason, but that's beside the point. Cinematic matches in wrestling are nothing new, but circumstances have forced many companies to invest more time in doing just that. The making movies part, not the drinking water like a weirdo part. WWE got the ball rolling with the aforementioned Boneyard and Firefly Funhouse matches, both highly acclaimed for their production values, and in the case of the Funhouse match, it's many layers of subtext and deeper meaning to what we saw Cena and Bray do. From there, it was off to the races as all the major companies started incorporating more pre-taped matches that took place out in the field. The Stadium Stampede, Money in the Bank, Wrestle House, the Elite Deletion, the Backlot Brawl, the Tooth and Nail match, EC3 vs. Moose, and so on, all with their own creative spins on the genre. And lest we forget, Talkin' Shopomanias 1 and 2. Some matches were meant to be more dramatic, others more comical, and in some cases a bit of both. Some of the matches were great, others not so much. But in an era where all these companies are doing whatever they can to be noticed, these cinematic matches meant there was really no limit as to what wrestlers could do in order to tell a story. And in my opinion, having no limits from a creative standpoint can often be a wonderful thing. Number 3. Drew McIntyre's 2020. These days, it's not often that WWE books a top babyface who is 1, dominant in the ring, 2, over with the fans, and 3, full-time. So when they finally handed the torch, or in this case the sword, to Drew McIntyre this year, it felt like a breath of fresh air. 2020 began with a bang for Drew as he not only eliminated Brock Lesnar in the Royal Rumble match, but won the whole enchilada in front of the biggest live crowd we'd see all year. From there, he continued to look strong as hell all the way up to WrestleMania when he knocked Lesnar off his perch to become the WWE Champion. A hell of a turnaround from his last stint in the company years earlier when he was released while fighting for airtime with 3MB. But it didn't end there. As champion, Drew mowed through all of his opposition, kicking out of finishers at 1 and just dominating challenger after challenger. It was surprising how strong he was booked all year, but it was a welcome surprise considering how so many babyface champs in the last several years have been booked to look weak against their opponents. I mean, Kofi won a lot as champion in 2019, but not like how Drew wins matches. But it isn't just the in-ring dominance that's so fun to watch. I mean, for me, most of his promos feel effortless. They feel real, not so much ham-fisted or overly scripted, which makes him and his story that much more relatable. In-ring talent can only get you so far. It's personality which is the key for success in wrestling, and Drew's got that in spades. In fact, the only real hiccup in Drew's record all year came at Hell in a Cell when Randy Orton beat him in their third encounter to become champion. A title change that ultimately didn't matter as Drew won it back like, 3 weeks later? Almost makes you wonder what the point of it was. I honestly can't think of a babyface champion run in the last several years that was met with overwhelmingly positive feedback quite like Drew's run on top, and it's still going strong as we begin 2021. There's a part of me that would be surprised if they kept this energy up for another year, but then again, there's a part of me that wouldn't. Number 2. Roman Reigns, Tribal Chief. At this time 1 year ago, Roman Reigns was the most booed individual in WWE, but at least now there's a good reason for it. As WWE was forced to change a lot of stuff going into WrestleMania, nothing was more impactful than Reigns asking to be removed from his Universal title match with Goldberg, citing his immunocompromised state from his bouts with leukemia. Months went by without a word as to his status, until he finally came back with a vengeance at SummerSlam, aligning himself with Paul Heyman, and winning the big blue belt just 1 week later. Since then, Roman's been delivering a weekly masterclass in heel work. His actions and his promos have been so downright cruel and mean and vicious and evil, finally showing fans what's been lurking inside him seemingly this entire time, resulting in great television. The stuff he did in the end of 2020 with the Usos and Kevin Owens has been phenomenal work. For the last 5 years, WWE made a concerted effort to get fans to universally like Roman Reigns, and with a few fleeting exceptions, that just didn't happen. For some fans, the only way the company could have saved Roman was to turn him heel. It may have happened years later than it probably should have, but it's definitely been worth the wait. And the best thing about wrestling in 2020 was wrestling kept on wrestling. If one thing will define this past year on Earth, it's the global COVID-19 pandemic. It affected every single person on the planet in some form or fashion, and it led to the closures and stoppages of things that we look to for entertainment, for comfort, for sanity. Wrestling is my source of those things. When Mania weekend was canceled, I was heartbroken like so many of you. I wondered how my hobby and my career would be affected by all this. By all rights, we shouldn't be running shows right now in this country as the numbers are only going up, but somehow, some way, wrestling has been able to keep going on. WWE and AEW never really stopped, and the other major promotions are slowly picking up steam again. And I have to admit, I'm kind of glad. Though the basic premise was the same, there were a lot of big differences, little to no crowds, and sudden lineup changes due to COVID scares or infections, things that in a normal year could have killed wrestling companies, but 2020 was far from a normal year, and I think in some cases this could make wrestling even stronger. If nothing else, this past year in wrestling was all about adaptation, experimentation, and innovation. There was the increase in the cinematic matches. We saw opportunities being given to men and women where there really was none before. We saw the debut of the Thunderdome. Wrestling took a lot of big chances this year, and in many of those cases, those chances paid off. Look, I'm not going to pretend these promotions have been doing all this out of the kindness of their hearts. There is a monetary reason to keep pushing forward, and of course, the risk of COVID is still there. But in a year where our collective mental health has been run through the ringer, it's important for things like wrestling or football or basketball or baseball to figure it out and keep going on, and in most of those cases, they were able to make it work. If wrestling did come to a standstill, I don't know what I would have done with myself all year. So for better or for worse, the fact that wrestling did stick around all year makes that the best thing about wrestling itself in 2020. What other great stuff from 2020 did I miss? Let me know in the comment section, and come back in 2 weeks for my worst of 2020 countdown. And don't worry about all this positivity in this video, because it's not going to be there in that one. I'm Brian Zane, and I'll see you next time.